Tonight, what seemed like a routine interview suddenly took an unexpected turn that no one in the studio saw coming. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? When a guest and a host begin a discussion that slowly shifts from casual promotion into something noticeably more serious. Moments like that are part of what makes daytime talk shows compelling, because viewers are watching people respond to each other in real time, without the ability to edit or reset the moment. And sometimes, even when everyone on stage intends to keep the conversation light, a single question can redirect the tone of the entire segment. Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice, and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. On this particular episode of The View, the panel had just returned from a commercial break. The audience inside the studio was still settling back into their seats as the hosts prepared to welcome their next guest. Sitting at the table were familiar faces, including longtime moderator Whoopi Goldberg, along with co-hosts Joy Behar, Sunny Hostin, and Sarah Haynes. The mood in the studio was relaxed, the kind of tone viewers expect from the program when a guest arrives to talk about a new project. That guest was actor James Franco, who had joined the show that morning to discuss a recent creative project and his continued work in film and literature. When he walked onto the stage, the audience greeted him with warm applause. Franco smiled, waved briefly, and took his seat across from the hosts. At first, the conversation followed a familiar pattern for daytime television interviews. Whoopi Goldberg welcomed him and thanked him for being on the show. She mentioned that audiences have seen Franco in a wide range of roles over the years, from dramatic films to comedies and even directing projects of his own. The tone was conversational and light. Franco responded comfortably, speaking about the process behind his latest project and how his interests have shifted over time. He talked about balancing acting with writing and directing, explaining that he enjoys exploring different forms of storytelling. The audience listened quietly, occasionally reacting with laughter when he shared small behind-the-scenes anecdotes. For the first several minutes, the exchange felt exactly like what viewers expect from a promotional interview. Joy Behar asked about how Franco chooses his roles and whether he ever worries about audience expectations when he moves between genres. Franco answered thoughtfully, explaining that he tries to focus more on the creative challenge rather than public expectations. But as often happens on talk shows like The View, the conversation gradually moved toward more serious territory. Sunny Hostin shifted the discussion slightly when she brought up how public figures are increasingly asked to address cultural and social issues during interviews. Her question wasn't confrontational, but it introduced a new layer to the conversation. She asked Franco whether he feels actors today are expected to comment on topics beyond their work. Franco paused briefly before answering. He acknowledged that public attention can come with complicated expectations. He explained that while actors primarily focus on creative work, they also live in a world where audiences want transparency and accountability. The tone of the conversation at this point was still calm, but the discussion had clearly moved away from simple promotion. Whoopi Goldberg leaned forward slightly in her chair, listening carefully as Franco spoke. After Franco finished his answer, Goldberg offered her own perspective. She explained that public figures often find themselves in conversations about broader cultural issues, whether they intend to or not. Her point was that television discussions frequently reflect the topics viewers are already talking about at home. It was during this moment that the tone of the exchange began to shift. Franco nodded while Goldberg spoke, but when she finished, he added a follow-up thought that subtly challenged part of what she had said. He mentioned that while conversations about culture are important, he sometimes feels that television discussions can oversimplify complicated topics. The comment wasn't aggressive, but it did introduce a small note of disagreement. Goldberg reacted immediately, though her response remained calm. She pointed out that live television discussions often require hosts to condense complicated issues into short segments. With limited time and multiple viewpoints at the table, she said, the goal is usually to start a conversation rather than fully resolve it. The audience responded with a few murmurs of agreement. Franco listened carefully, but he didn't completely back away from his point. Instead, he explained that from the perspective of someone being interviewed, those conversations can sometimes feel rushed or framed in ways that don't leave room for nuance. Joy Behar glanced toward Goldberg with a small smile, recognizing that the conversation had moved into a more serious direction. She lightly joked that time limits are the unofficial enemy of every talk show host. The audience laughed, and for a moment the tension eased. But the exchange between Franco and Goldberg continued. Goldberg responded again, clarifying that the purpose of the show isn't necessarily to pressure guests, but to create a space where viewers can hear different viewpoints. She emphasized that sometimes disagreement is part of healthy conversation. Franco nodded again, but he leaned slightly forward as he spoke next, signaling that he wanted to clarify his position. He said he respected that goal, but he also believed that guests occasionally feel boxed into answering questions that don't fully reflect the complexity of what they're trying to say. At this point, the tone in the studio was noticeably more focused. The hosts weren't interrupting each other, but everyone at the table was paying close attention. Sunny Hostin watched the exchange carefully, while Sarah Haynes looked between Franco and Goldberg as if anticipating where the discussion might go next. Goldberg then responded in a measured tone, pointing out that guests always have the option to redirect a conversation if they feel a question isn't being framed properly. She explained that part of live television is navigating those moments together in real time. Franco acknowledged that point, but he added that sometimes viewers only see short clips of interviews afterward, which can change how the conversation is interpreted. That comment drew a noticeable reaction from the audience. A few people nodded while others remained quiet, clearly listening closely to how the discussion was unfolding. At this stage, the disagreement was still respectful, but it had become the central focus of the segment. Joy Behar stepped in again, attempting to balance the conversation. She asked Franco whether he felt the media environment today makes it harder for public figures to express complicated ideas. Franco answered that it can be challenging, especially in an era where discussions often move quickly online. He explained that once a clip circulates on social media, people may interpret it without the full context of the original conversation. Goldberg listened carefully, then offered a brief response that brought the discussion back to the role of talk shows like The View. She explained that the panel often asks difficult questions because audiences expect honest discussions. The tone between them remained controlled, but viewers watching closely could tell that both Franco and Goldberg were standing firmly behind their perspectives. The studio audience, meanwhile, had grown noticeably quieter than earlier in the segment. Instead of laughter and applause, the room now carried the attentive silence that often appears when a conversation becomes more serious. And at that point, what had started as a routine guest interview had clearly transformed into something different, a thoughtful but increasingly direct exchange between a guest and the show's moderator, unfolding live in front of a national audience. As the discussion continued, the other hosts prepared to weigh in, and the moment slowly built toward a broader panel conversation that would shape the rest of the segment in ways the audience likely hadn't expected when James Franco first walked onto the stage. As the conversation continued at the table, the shift in tone was subtle but noticeable to anyone watching closely. What had begun as a straightforward guest interview was now turning into a broader discussion about media, public conversation, and how live television handles complicated topics. The audience in the studio remained quiet, listening closely as both sides carefully explained their perspectives. James Franco leaned slightly forward in his chair as he continued speaking. His tone remained measured, but he clearly wanted to explain his viewpoint more fully. He clarified that he wasn't criticizing talk shows specifically, but rather pointing out a challenge that exists across television and digital media. He explained that many public discussions today move very quickly, and that speed sometimes makes it difficult to explore deeper context. Franco said that when someone is asked a complicated question on live television, there may only be a minute or two to respond, even if the topic could easily require much longer. Across the table, Whoopi Goldberg listened without interrupting. She kept her posture relaxed, her hands folded lightly on the table as Franco finished his thought. When he paused, Goldberg responded calmly, acknowledging that time limits are part of television production. She explained that shows like The View work within a structured format. Each segment has a specific length, commercial breaks are scheduled in advance, and multiple hosts must share time to ask questions. Because of that, she said, the goal isn't always to provide a full academic discussion, but to create a starting point for viewers. The audience offered a small round of applause as she finished speaking. Franco nodded in response, showing that he understood the practical reality of the format. Still, he added that from a guest's perspective, those constraints can sometimes make conversations feel more confrontational than they are meant to be. At this moment, Joy Behar leaned in slightly and joined the discussion again. Behar has long been known for her quick commentary, and she brought a lighter tone to the moment. She joked that if talk shows allowed unlimited time for every answer, the audience might still be sitting there at midnight waiting for the next segment to begin. The studio audience laughed, breaking the tension for a moment. Franco smiled at the comment, acknowledging the humor. But he then added something that gently brought the conversation back to the core issue he was describing. He said that while the time limits are understandable, the way questions are framed can also shape how viewers interpret a guest's response. That remark caught the attention of several hosts at once. Sunny Hostin turned slightly toward Franco and asked him to explain what he meant. Her tone wasn't confrontational, but it signaled that the panel wanted more clarity. Franco explained that sometimes the phrasing of a question can imply a particular viewpoint before the guest even begins answering. When that happens, he said, the guest may feel like they're responding to an assumption rather than simply sharing their perspective. Goldberg responded almost immediately, though her tone remained composed. She said that in her experience, asking direct questions is part of honest conversation. Viewers expect hosts to address the issues that people are already discussing at home. The audience reacted with another brief round of applause. Franco acknowledged the point again, but he didn't fully step away from his earlier observation. Instead, he explained that he believes audiences benefit when conversations allow space for uncertainty and nuance. At this stage, the exchange between Franco and Goldberg had become the central focus of the segment. The rest of the panel watched closely, stepping in occasionally, but largely allowing the discussion to unfold. Sarah Haynes shifted in her chair slightly before joining the conversation. She said that one of the challenges of live television is balancing curiosity with clarity. Hosts want to ask meaningful questions, but they also have to keep the conversation moving so viewers remain engaged. Franco agreed that maintaining viewer attention is important. He then pointed out that the rise of short clips on social media has added another layer of complexity. A conversation that lasts several minutes on television may later be reduced to a 30-second clip online. That comment prompted a few murmurs of agreement from the audience. Goldberg responded thoughtfully, acknowledging that the media landscape has changed dramatically over the years. She explained that when she first started working in television, interviews were rarely broken into short digital clips the way they are today. Still, she said that hosts have a responsibility to ask clear questions, especially when topics involve public debate. At this point, the pace of the conversation slowed slightly. The discussion had become more reflective than tense, but the disagreement was still present. Franco then offered a personal example from past interviews. Without naming specific programs, he described moments where a conversation about creative work shifted suddenly into broader social questions. He said he understood why those topics come up, but he sometimes feels guests need more space to respond thoughtfully. Goldberg listened carefully, nodding once before answering. She said that part of being a public figure is recognizing that audiences often connect creative work with cultural conversation. Her point was that art, entertainment, and social issues often intersect. Franco agreed with that idea in principle, but he added that he believes those discussions work best when both sides feel comfortable explaining their full perspective. At this moment, the audience could sense that the exchange was approaching a delicate balance. Both Franco and Goldberg were speaking calmly, but they were also clearly defending their viewpoints. Joy Behar glanced toward the production crew briefly, likely aware that the segment's timing was becoming tight. Still, the conversation continued. Sunny Hostin spoke again, asking Franco whether he felt that talk shows sometimes expect guests to provide simple answers to complex questions. Franco replied that he doesn't believe hosts intentionally oversimplify issues. Instead, he said the format itself naturally pushes discussions toward quick conclusions. Goldberg responded with a thoughtful pause before speaking again. She explained that while time limits are real, the panel tries to create space for honest disagreement. In fact, she said, moments like the one unfolding at that table were part of what makes live television interesting. The audience applauded again, though the reaction was quieter than earlier applause. Franco acknowledged that point and said he appreciated being able to share his perspective directly on the show. However, he added one final thought that subtly pushed the conversation further. He said that sometimes when guests challenge the structure of the conversation itself, it can feel uncomfortable in the moment. But those moments may also help improve how discussions happen in the future. That comment prompted a brief pause across the table. Goldberg leaned back slightly in her chair, considering the remark before responding. The audience inside the studio grew noticeably quiet again, sensing that the discussion was approaching another turning point. What had started as a calm exchange about media dynamics was slowly evolving into a deeper debate about the responsibilities of hosts, guests, and the format of live television itself. And as the cameras continued rolling, the panel prepared to respond to Franco's latest point, a moment that would further shape the direction of the conversation during the remainder of the segment. The pause that followed created a brief moment where the atmosphere in the studio felt more focused than tense. Everyone at the table seemed aware that the discussion had moved well beyond a typical promotional interview. The cameras continued rolling, the audience remained attentive, and the panel prepared to respond to the point that James Franco had just made about how conversations on television sometimes evolve in ways that even the participants don't anticipate. Across from him, Whoopi Goldberg leaned slightly forward again before answering. Her voice stayed calm and measured, but there was a clear sense that she wanted to address the issue directly rather than move past it quickly. Goldberg explained that one of the reasons a show like The View has remained on television for so many years is precisely because it doesn't avoid moments of disagreement. She said that viewers tune in not only to hear interviews, but also to watch conversations unfold naturally, even when the people involved see things differently. The audience responded with light applause. Goldberg then added that when a guest raises concerns about the format or direction of a discussion, it can actually be helpful because it reminds everyone watching that the conversation is happening live and unscripted. She emphasized that the panel does not expect every guest to agree with them. Franco nodded as she spoke, listening closely. When Goldberg finished, he responded in a thoughtful tone. He said that he appreciated the openness of the format and that he respected the fact that the hosts were willing to engage with his point rather than simply redirect the conversation back to his project. However, he clarified that his earlier comments were not meant as criticism of the panel personally. Instead, he said he was describing something he has experienced across multiple interviews in different media settings. That clarification seemed to ease the atmosphere slightly. At that moment, Joy Behar jumped back into the conversation. She tilted her head slightly toward Franco and asked him a question that reframed the issue from another angle. Behar wondered whether the challenge he was describing might actually reflect the way audiences consume media today rather than the way talk shows operate. She pointed out that viewers often expect immediate reactions and clear opinions, especially when topics involve public debates or cultural conversations. According to Behar, the pressure to deliver those clear responses can come from the audience as much as from the hosts asking the questions. The audience in the studio murmured quietly in response to that point. Franco acknowledged that idea and said he believed Behar was probably right about audience expectations playing a role. He explained that the pace of public conversation has changed significantly over the past decade. He said that when discussions move quickly online, people sometimes look for simple statements that summarize a complicated issue. But when those statements are pulled from longer interviews, they can appear more definitive than the speaker originally intended. As he spoke, several members of the panel nodded. Sunny Hostin then entered the conversation again. Hostin has a legal background and often approaches discussions from an analytical perspective. She asked Franco whether he believed there was a way for public interviews to balance clarity with nuance. Franco paused for a moment before answering. He said he didn't believe there was a perfect solution, but he suggested that conversations might benefit from acknowledging uncertainty more openly. He explained that sometimes the most honest answer to a complicated question is that the person being asked is still thinking about it. In his view, audiences might appreciate that kind of honesty if it became more common. Goldberg listened carefully before responding again. She said that she actually agreed with part of that idea. In many discussions on the show, she explained, the hosts themselves often disagree with each other. That dynamic allows viewers to hear multiple viewpoints rather than a single definitive answer. The audience responded with another brief round of applause. However, Goldberg also added that television interviews still require a certain level of clarity because viewers need to understand what is being said within a limited amount of time. Franco acknowledged that reality as well, though he gently returned to his earlier point about how framing can influence interpretation. He explained that when a discussion begins with a strong assumption built into the question, the guest may spend most of their answer responding to that assumption instead of addressing the broader topic. At this point, the exchange between Franco and Goldberg had become noticeably more direct than it had been earlier in the segment. Neither person raised their voice, but both were clearly engaging with the substance of the discussion. The studio audience remained quiet, listening closely. Sarah Haynes looked between the two speakers before adding a comment of her own. She suggested that moments like the one happening at the table were actually an example of how live conversation can work productively. She said that instead of avoiding disagreement, the panel was allowing it to unfold respectfully, which might actually demonstrate the kind of nuanced discussion Franco was describing. That observation drew a few approving nods from the audience. Franco smiled slightly and said he appreciated that perspective. He acknowledged that the conversation itself was proving that respectful disagreement can happen on live television without becoming hostile or overly dramatic. Goldberg responded with a small smile as well, saying that this kind of discussion was exactly what the show aims to create. However, the conversation took another thoughtful turn when Hostin raised a related question about responsibility. She asked Franco whether public figures sometimes underestimate how much influence their words can carry once they are broadcast. Franco responded carefully. He said that he believes people in the public do have a responsibility to speak thoughtfully, especially when discussing topics that affect broader communities. But he also believes audiences benefit from hearing people think through ideas rather than delivering perfectly polished statements. Goldberg listened quietly as he finished. She then responded with a point that brought the conversation closer to the core purpose of daytime talk shows. She explained that the goal of the program isn't necessarily to produce perfect answers, but to encourage viewers to continue the conversation in their own lives. According to Goldberg, if a discussion on television prompts viewers to talk with friends or family about the same topic later, the show has accomplished something meaningful. The audience applauded again, this time a bit more strongly. Franco acknowledged that perspective and said he agreed that encouraging discussion is valuable. Still, he added one final observation that subtly returned the focus to the earlier disagreement. He said that for conversations to continue beyond television, people need to feel that their viewpoints are being heard accurately in the moment. When he finished speaking, the table fell briefly quiet again. Goldberg leaned back slightly in her chair, considering the comment before preparing to respond. The atmosphere in the studio had become reflective rather than tense, but it was clear that the discussion had developed into one of the more serious exchanges of the morning. The audience remained attentive as the hosts prepared to move the conversation forward, aware that the next few minutes would likely determine how the segment ultimately concluded. The conversation continued with a noticeably thoughtful tone as the panel and the guest remained focused on the broader ideas they had been discussing. By this point in the segment, the audience could clearly see that what began as a routine interview had turned into a reflective discussion about the nature of public conversation and live television. Whoopi Goldberg sat back for a moment after hearing James Franco explain his point about people wanting their viewpoints to be heard accurately. She nodded slowly, then leaned forward again, signaling that she wanted to respond carefully rather than move past the idea. Goldberg began by acknowledging that Franco had raised something many guests likely think about when appearing on television. She said that the balance between clarity and accuracy can be difficult, especially during live discussions where there is no opportunity to revise or expand an answer later. The audience listened quietly as she continued. She explained that from the perspective of someone who has hosted television conversations for many years, the goal is to create a space where ideas can be expressed honestly, even if those ideas are still evolving. Goldberg said that the panel often asks questions not because they expect a perfect answer, but because viewers at home are already asking similar questions themselves. Franco nodded again as she spoke, and when she finished he responded in a calm voice. He said he respected that approach, and that he understood why the show invites a range of guests with different viewpoints. But he also emphasized that moments like the one they were experiencing were actually useful because they showed viewers how conversations develop in real time. According to Franco, the exchange itself demonstrated that disagreement doesn't have to become hostile or dramatic to be meaningful. The audience responded with a light round of applause. At this point, Joy Behar leaned forward slightly and added a comment that helped broaden the conversation again. Behar observed that one of the reasons viewers continue to watch The View is precisely because the hosts and guests sometimes challenge each other. She joked that if every interview consisted only of compliments and promotional talking points, the show would probably feel less interesting to the audience. The studio laughed softly, and the atmosphere relaxed again. Franco smiled at the comment and acknowledged that she was probably right. He said that as a viewer himself, he often finds candid conversations more engaging than strictly promotional segments. However, he added that the challenge comes when those candid moments are later interpreted differently once they appear online or in headlines. This remark prompted Sunny Hostin to join the discussion once more. Hostin asked Franco whether he believes guests should adapt their communication style to the modern media environment. Her question was thoughtful and measured, but it introduced another angle to the conversation. Franco paused briefly before answering. He said he believed everyone appearing in public conversations has to be mindful of how their words might be interpreted later. At the same time, he explained that overthinking every sentence can sometimes make discussions feel less natural. He added that one reason people enjoy live television is that it captures authentic reactions rather than perfectly scripted responses. Goldberg nodded at that point, agreeing that authenticity is part of what makes daytime talk shows appealing. She explained that the hosts themselves often speak spontaneously during discussions. While they prepare topics in advance, the actual conversation is rarely scripted word for word. Goldberg then pointed out that viewers at home can usually tell when people are speaking honestly rather than repeating prepared statements. The audience applauded again. Sarah Haynes joined the discussion next, reflecting on how the exchange had unfolded during the segment. She noted that earlier in the interview, the conversation had been focused primarily on Franco's creative work. But as the discussion continued, it naturally shifted toward broader questions about media and communication. Haynes suggested that this type of shift is actually common during live television interviews. Franco agreed with her observation and said that sometimes those unexpected shifts produce the most interesting parts of the conversation. Still, he gently returned to the idea that guests occasionally feel pressure to provide immediate answers to complicated questions. Goldberg responded thoughtfully, acknowledging that point again while offering her own perspective as a host. She explained that part of the host's responsibility is to represent the curiosity of the audience. If viewers have questions about a particular issue, the panel often feels obligated to address those questions during the interview. However, she also emphasized that the show tries to give guests the opportunity to explain their views in their own words. The audience remained attentive, clearly interested in how the exchange was unfolding. At this stage of the conversation, the tone had become less about disagreement and more about reflection. Both Franco and Goldberg appeared comfortable discussing the topic openly, and the rest of the panel continued to contribute thoughtfully. Joy Behar glanced toward the production crew briefly, aware that the segment was approaching its final minutes. Live television always operates within strict timing, and the hosts needed to begin guiding the conversation toward a conclusion. Behar turned back toward Franco and asked a final question designed to bring the discussion back to the audience. She asked whether he believed conversations like this one could help improve the way public discussions happen in media. Franco considered the question carefully before answering. He said he believed that open exchanges, even when they include disagreement, can encourage people to listen more closely to each other. According to Franco, the key is maintaining respect while allowing different viewpoints to be expressed honestly. Goldberg nodded as he spoke. When Franco finished, she added that respectful disagreement has always been part of meaningful conversation. She pointed out that the hosts themselves often debate each other on the show, and viewers have come to expect those moments. Goldberg then smiled slightly and said that the conversation they were having at that very moment was a good example of how discussion can remain constructive even when people see things differently. The audience applauded warmly. With only a short amount of time left before the next commercial break, the panel prepared to wrap up the segment. But the discussion had already left a strong impression on viewers in the studio. What began as a standard interview had evolved into a thoughtful exchange about communication, media expectations, and the nature of live television, a moment that would likely continue to draw attention after the episode finished airing. As the conversation reached its final moments, the atmosphere in the studio felt noticeably calmer than it had earlier in the segment. What had briefly developed into a thoughtful disagreement had gradually turned into a reflective discussion about how conversations happen on live television. The audience remained attentive as the panel prepared to close the interview with James Franco. At the table, Whoopi Goldberg glanced briefly toward the production crew, a familiar signal that the segment was nearing its scheduled end. On live programs like The View, timing is always a factor, and even the most engaging discussions eventually need to transition toward a closing. Goldberg turned back toward Franco with a relaxed smile, acknowledging that the conversation had taken an unexpected but meaningful direction. She thanked him for being open about his perspective and said that discussions like the one they had just shared were part of what keeps daytime television interesting. The audience applauded warmly. Franco responded with appreciation, saying he was glad the conversation had unfolded honestly rather than being rushed or redirected. He explained that one of the reasons he enjoys appearing on talk shows is the opportunity to speak directly with people who bring different viewpoints to the table. He added that while interviews often focus on promoting creative work, moments like this allow for broader discussions that audiences may not always expect. Joy Behar leaned in with a small smile and joked that sometimes the best television happens when nobody at the table knows exactly where the conversation will go next. The audience laughed lightly, recognizing the truth in the comment. Behar then briefly returned the conversation to Franco's current project, giving him a chance to mention it again before the segment ended. It was a typical move for daytime television. Even after a serious discussion, the show still makes time to highlight the guest's work. Franco spoke briefly about the project, explaining what interested him about the story and what he hopes audiences will take away from it. His answer was concise, likely because everyone at the table knew the segment was nearly finished. As he spoke, the tone in the studio returned to the lighter atmosphere that had been present when the interview first began. When Franco finished, Sunny Hostin offered a final comment about the discussion that had taken place earlier in the segment. She said that one of the strengths of the show is its willingness to allow conversations to evolve naturally, even when the topic becomes more serious than originally planned. She added that respectful exchanges, like the one viewers had just watched, can help demonstrate how people with different viewpoints can still communicate productively. The audience applauded again. Goldberg nodded in agreement and then addressed the viewers watching from home. She explained that the show always encourages honest conversation and that moments of disagreement are part of that process. According to Goldberg, what matters most is how people handle those moments. Franco acknowledged the point and said he appreciated the opportunity to discuss the topic openly. He added that conversations about media and communication are especially important today because so much public discussion now happens in short clips and online commentary. Sarah Haynes smiled and noted that the conversation they had just shared would probably spark a lot of discussion among viewers as well. Goldberg then thanked Franco once more for joining the show and for participating in the conversation. The audience responded with strong applause as the segment wrapped up. The camera pulled back slightly, showing the entire table as the hosts prepared to transition to the next portion of the program. The exchange had remained respectful throughout, but it had clearly been one of the more thoughtful interviews of the morning. After the broadcast continued into the next segment, many viewers began sharing reactions online. Short clips from the discussion between Franco and Goldberg quickly appeared across social media platforms, where audiences debated the ideas that had been raised during the interview. Some viewers praised the conversation for remaining calm and thoughtful even while addressing disagreement. Others focused on the broader questions Franco had raised about how interviews are framed and how conversations are interpreted once they circulate online. Many longtime viewers of The View also commented that moments like this are part of what makes the program unique. Because the show is broadcast live, discussions can sometimes move in unexpected directions, giving audiences the opportunity to watch real reactions rather than rehearsed exchanges. Clips of the moment where Franco discussed nuance in media conversations were shared widely, with some viewers agreeing that complex issues are often difficult to address in short segments. Others defended Goldberg's perspective, pointing out that live television must balance thoughtful discussion with limited time. Within hours of the broadcast, entertainment commentators began referencing the exchange as an example of how daytime talk shows sometimes become a platform for broader discussions about media itself. Neither Franco nor Goldberg appeared to treat the moment as a conflict. Instead, both seemed comfortable acknowledging that the conversation had simply developed in a different direction than originally planned. Later in the day, several viewers who had attended the taping in the studio shared their impressions online as well. Many said the atmosphere in the room had felt thoughtful rather than tense. According to those audience members, the discussion seemed like a natural exchange of ideas rather than a confrontation. Some viewers also pointed out that the tone of the conversation remained respectful from beginning to end, even when the perspectives being expressed were different. That balance, disagreement without hostility, is something many audiences say they appreciate about discussions on daytime television. By the time the episode finished airing across the country, the segment had become one of the most talked about moments from that day's broadcast. Not because of shouting or dramatic conflict, but because it showed how a simple interview can sometimes evolve into a deeper conversation about the way people communicate in public spaces. In the end, the exchange between James Franco and Whoopi Goldberg served as a reminder of what live talk shows often do best, allowing real conversations to unfold in real time, with all the nuance, reflection, and occasional disagreement that comes with them. And now we want to hear from you. What did you think about the conversation between James Franco and Whoopi Goldberg? Do you think discussions like this help improve public conversations? Or should interviews stay focused only on the guest's work? Share your opinion in the comments, and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.